So hello everybody and welcome to the last session of the PWL International Seminar this year. This is already our 18th session and there's still two more sessions to go before our Mapping Philosophy as a Way of Life project ends in February next year. And really, I couldn't be happier to introduce you to our speaker today. Lucilla Guidi is a dear old friend and collaborator of our group. The first time we invited her to Lisbon, we didn't even have this project yet, so she has been accompanying this trajectory from very early on. And listening to her talks is always a tremendous pleasure, even if this time, unfortunately, we need to do it at a distance. In any case, thank you so much for accepting this invitation, Lucilla, and we are really very, very happy and honored to have you with us today.
Thank you.
So
Thanks a
Lucilla,
lot. I'm very happy. It's a delight to be here and to have the opportunity to discuss with all the group and with you, Marta. Thanks a lot for the invitation. And it's pretty important for me because you give me the opportunity to think about this issue. I mean, to think about the philosophical investigation from the perspective of philosophy as a way of life. And it's a work in progress. That's why it's a very pleasure to discuss this topic. And I'm very looking forward to your remarks and your impressions about this reading. I will share my...
Lucilla, let me just say a couple of words about you. I'm sure most of the people know you, but generally I just say that, Lucilla Guidi is assistant professor in ethics and aesthetics at the University of Potsdam in Germany. She earned her PhD in philosophy in co-tutel between Italy and Germany and was visiting scholar at the Humboldt University of Berlin, a postdoc researcher at the Technical University of Dresden, and a postdoc researcher within the DFG Research Training Group Aesthetic Practice based at University of Hildesheim, also in Germany. Her research focuses on the transformative dimension of philosophy as a way of life and on the performative constitution of everyday life practices. And for this purpose, she draws on post-Kantian philosophical traditions, particularly phenomenology, Wittgenstein's philosophy of language, and the paradigm of performativity. She has published quite a lot on the topic in the recent years, including the monograph in Italian, Il rovescio del performativo, I hope I pronounced it correctly. And she also edited the volumes Phenomenology as Performative Exercise in 2020 and Wittgensteinian Exercises, Aesthetic and Ethical Transformations in 2023, both with Brill. She is also co-editor of Brill Think series, Aesthetic Practice, Transdisciplinary Perspectives, and I could go on, but I think it's good as an introduction for now. Today, she's going to talk about Wittgenstein, and the title of her talk is Wittgenstein's Philosophical Investigations as Self-Transformative Practices of Imagination. So thank you again, Lucilla, and the screen is yours now.
Thanks a lot, Marta, for the nice introduction, and I will try to share my screen. Okay, in my talk, I will examine Wittgenstein's philosophical investigation in the light of Pierre Hadot's accounts of philosophy as a spiritual exercises. First of all, I will focus on the aesthetic literary form of the investigation to emphasize that I embody an open-ended dialogue with oneself that aims to transform one way of seeing things and thus our attitude toward ourselves, others, and the world. Second, I will draw on Wittgenstein reflections on aspect seeing and aspect blindness. I wish to underline that the difference between the two points to a difference of attitude. What is at stake then is an attitude toward other person, but more extensively toward meaning. That is to say, what is at stake is the whole way we relate to ourselves, others, and the world. Furthermore, I will argue that Wittgenstein's exploration of a community of aspect-blind people embodies an exercise of the imagination and has a self-transformative function. Through this practice, one engages in an ongoing critical confrontation both with one's personal and social embodied prejudice and blindness, and with one's own Cartesian habits of thought. Hence, on the one hand, through these exercises, one becomes aware of the various ways in which one avoids taking responsibility for expressing oneself, responding to others, and contributing to the expressiveness of our shared life in language. On the other hand, through these exercises, one becomes aware of one's own Cartesian self-understanding as a self-sufficient and sovereign subjects. Third, in the final part of the talk, I will sketch out 3 further kinds of exercises of the imagination involved in the investigation. The first confronts us with impossible tasks. It invites us to imagine where the Cartesian metaphysical pictures and habits of thought lead us in order to make us aware of them. The second kind of exercise, the most pervasive one, refers to Wittgenstein's very method of übersichtliche Darstellung. The latter can be understood as a series of practices of imagination that, through the use of analogies and pictures, invite us to look at things from different perspectives, thereby shifting their context, revealing new aspects of them, and thus changing our way of seeing them. The third kind of exercise invites us to imagine fictional or altered form of life, so as to make us confront ourselves with our dogmatic inclination and to train our sense of possibility. Accordingly, I will emphasize that the investigation embody open-ended, self-transformative practices of imagination that cultivate our sensitivity to ourselves, others, and the world, and invite us to a critical self-examination. I start with the first step. In his work, Philosophy is a Way of Life, Pierre Hadot has underlined that philosophy, especially the Greco-Roman tradition, is not concerned with teaching and developing theories. Rather, philosophy aims at, I quote, the transformation of our vision of the world and the metamorphosis of our being. Such an approach requires more than a mere intellectual effort, since it involves our personalities as a whole, that is, our practical habits and inclinations, ways of perceiving, and emotional dispositions. The transformation required by philosophy entails a change of one's way of life. The latter cannot be achieved in one go, but must be pursued gradually through the repeated and passionate practice of numerous exercises. As Hadot puts this point, I quote, just as by dint of repeated physical exercises, athletes give new form and strength to their body, so the philosopher develops his strength and of the soul, modifies his inner climate, transforms his vision of the world, and finally his entire being. It's worth emphasizing that the style of Wittgenstein philosophical investigation can be understood as a trace of spiritual exercises. Indeed, the style of investigation reflects a constant effort to transform our vision of the world and our entire way of life. Wittgenstein's self-writings embodies, as Lars Letten underlines, I quote, a therapeutic exercise, albeit a modern version. It's noteworthy that the investigations are fundamentally dialogic. The reader is involved in a dialogue between different voices, or more precisely, a struggle between voices and conflicting perspectives. This struggle can be understood as a difficult conversation of the philosophizing subject with ourselves. For Pierre Hadot, this is the pivotal and distinctive feature of a spiritual exercise. As he put it, I quote, we must let ourselves be changed in our point of view, attitudes, and convictions. This means that we must dialogue with ourselves, and hence we must do battle with ourselves. Wittgenstein's practice of self-writing, therefore, as Lars Letten has shown, can be conceived of, I quote, as an exercise in conversing with oneself. Anyone who carefully reads Wittgenstein investigations will be drawn into this dialogue, this internal struggle. It's also important to remember that Hadot put forward the idea of philosophy as a way of life for hermeneutic purpose. Ancient texts are often difficult to interpret due to their various form and genre. They cannot be read as theoretical systematic writings that aim to convey theses or theories. Hadot reminds us that the literary forms of such writings are indeed crucial. Such writings need to be situated in their practical contexts. One must consider their practical and transformative purposes, instead of complaining about the alleged ambiguity of their content because of their unsystematic styles. The philosophical content of such writings cannot be separated from their aesthetic, literary style. Moreover, it's important to recall that Hadot begins to make sense of the variety of ancient texts and their transformative purposes with reference to Wittgenstein's account of language games. On the one hand, Hadot highlights Wittgenstein's remark that language can be used for a variety of purposes in different contexts. In this way, Hadot underlines that the purpose of ancient texts was not to provide theories, but rather to engage the readers in self-transformative practices. On the other hand, Hadot stresses that Wittgenstein's own writings are examples of this impossibility of separating the style of such writings from their philosophical contents. Wittgenstein's writing, Hadot insists, have a transformative purpose. Already in 1959, before the publication of Philosophy as a Way of Life, Hadot noted that Wittgenstein's later writings use a certain literary genre because of their therapeutic and transformative purposes. From this perspective, the style of the investigation reflects a series of self-transformative practices and can be understood in light of Hadot's accounts of spiritual exercises. In the line of Hadot's spiritual exercises, such writings aim to transform our vision. As is well known, Wittgenstein described his account of philosophy, I quote, as a work on oneself, on one's own conceptions, on how one sees things and what one expects of them. In this lifelong engagement with one's own metaphysical conception lies Wittgenstein's transformative account of philosophy. In the philosophical investigation, Wittgenstein also refers to this preconception as philosophical, I quote, requirements, bumps, illness, disorientation, and captivating pictures. The form of dialogue between different voices pervades Wittgenstein's investigation. As Cavell has pointed out, the metaphysical voice of temptation and voice of correction are only two of the voices that speak in the investigation. One can further argue that Wittgenstein's text is marked by a constitutive polyphony, that is, an incessant dialogue and struggle between different metaphysical voices. These voices are not only staged in the investigation, but they inhabit Wittgenstein's life and his relationship to himself, as well as the reader's relationship to herself. In the aesthetic form of the investigation, in the style of this text, an ongoing dialogue, a struggle takes place. These metaphysical voices are not only and not primarily theoretical positions, but more radically they embody practical attitudes. They are ways of seeing things. From this perspective, this dialogue between different metaphysical voices also involves the reader, and thus reflects a struggle between different attitudes toward ourselves, others, and the world. In the big typescript, Wittgenstein describes these different metaphysical voices and the related difficulty of philosophy, I quote, as resistance of the will. He writes, I quote, difficulty of philosophy is not the intellectual difficulty of the science, but the difficulty of a change of attitude. Resistance of the will must be overcome, end quote. In order to examine what kind of attitudes Wittgenstein's investigation aims to transform, and in what sense Wittgenstein speaks of the practice of philosophy as a transformation of a way of seeing, I propose to draw on Wittgenstein reflections on aspect seeing and aspect blindness, contained in Philosophy of Psychology, a fragment formerly known as Part 2 of the investigations. If the main purpose of Wittgenstein philosophical practice is to change our way of seeing things and thus our attitude, then it's crucial to consider what kind of blindness Wittgenstein's philosophy aims to therapeutically transform. I wish to consider some form of blindness from which we suffer and with which we are confronted in Wittgenstein's transformative philosophical practice. For this purpose, I will consider two main forms of everyday aspect blindness. The first concerns the expression of others, and the second concerns the fine shades of meaning of our shade practice of language, and thus of our world. The first form of aspect blindness pertains to our relation to others. Here, I will examine aspect blindness as an inexpressive attitude toward others, according to Wittgenstein's distinction between seeing as and mere knowing, so as to further examine it in light of Cavell's distinction between knowing and acknowledging others. In this way, I will argue that this form of aspect blindness involves an unwillingness or reluctance to imagine new interpretative contexts in order to see and acknowledge another expressions against an interpretative background which sheds light on it. In a second step, I will consider a second form of blindness, that is, a blindness to the fine shades of meaning of our shared life and the world. In this context, I will examine aspect blindness as inexpressive attitude toward meaning, that is to say, as a way of emptying out our contribution to the expressiveness of our life in language, that is, in the world. In order to address the first form of blindness, I would like to begin by considering more generally how Wittgenstein described the attitude, in this case toward pictures, which marks the aspect blind. I quote, "Is the aspect blind supposed to be unable to see the schematic cube as a cube? It would not follow this that he could not recognize it as a representation, a working drawing, for instance, of the cube. But for him, it would not switch from one aspect to the other." I quote, "To me, it is an animal transfixed by an arrow. That is what I treat it as. This is my attitude to the figure. This is one meaning in calling it a case of seeing." I quote again, "When should I call it just knowing, not seeing? Perhaps when one treats the picture as a working drawing, reads it like a blueprint. Fine shades of behavior. Why are they important? They have important consequences." What would it mean then to be blind to the expression of others, to read another face like a working drawing, thereby just knowing it? What is the difference in attitude toward the other person that marks the aspect blind, the one who cannot see the timidity of a face in all these shades, that is, I quote, in the full sense of the word, but merely know it? I would argue that aspect blindness points to an inexpressive mode of living. Recall that Wittgenstein describes the aspect blind by comparing him to an automaton. I quote, "If someone were what we called meaning blind, we should picture him as making a less lively impression than we do, behaving more like an automaton." Following this comparison, and with reference to the distinction Wittgenstein draws between seeing a picture as a picture and just knowing it, I would describe those who are blind to expression of a face as those who do not see and respond to that individual human person in an expressive way, since they do not see the fine shades of behavior. The aspect blind does not see the person's face against a background of a particular context, that is, through, I quote, "those patterns which recur with variation against which an expression lights up in its individuality." As Wittgenstein writes, I quote, we react to a facial expression differently from someone who does not recognize it as a timid in the full sense of the word. But I do not want to say here that we feel this reaction in our muscle and joints and that this is the sensing. No, what we have here is a modified concept of sensing. Hence, seeing a shy face does not mean seeing via eyesight a physiological reaction through the eyes and inferring the emotion from it. Wittgenstein writes, I quote, "We see emotion, we do not see facial contortions and make inference from them to joy, grief, boredom. We describe a face immediately as sad, radiant, bored." Thus, seeing emotion as expression, as Silvana Boruti puts this crucial point, means, I quote, seeing the physiognomy, the form, the aspect. Seeing the aspect is not seeing properties, but seeing through the aspect, the new light, the certain connection shed on the all. The aspect blind does not see and sense this particular embodied expression in light of certain connections, so as to respond to the person in an expressive way, but just knowing the other's behavior without seeing its shades, the aspect blind failed to sense and respond to the very individuality of the person. Cavell has drawn attention to the distinction between knowing and acknowledging in relation to our knowledge of others, and has further shown its ethical relevance. Cavell writes, I quote, "To know another mind is to interpret a physiognomy, and the message of the investigation is that this is not a matter of mere knowing. I have to read the physiognomy and see the creature according to my reading and treat it according to my seeing. This means your suffering makes a claim upon me. It's not enough that I know, I'm certain that you suffer. I must do or reveal something, whatever can be done. In a word, I must acknowledge it." In order to appreciate the difference in attitude that characterize someone who sees the expression of a face in all its shades and someone who merely knows, I would like to reflect on the way in which, according to Cavell, knowledge and acknowledgement overlap and sometimes exclude each other. For example, I'm late for an appointment and everyone is waiting. Can I know that I'm late without admitting it? Of course. But can I admit that I'm late without knowing it? I cannot. Can I just know that you are suffering without acknowledging your suffering? If I flatly state you are suffering, as if reporting a fact, without expressing anything in the light of it, I may well hurt you. On the other hand, if I articulate similar words, by acknowledging your emotional situation, I will have exercised a form of acknowledgement. What is relevant here is not the cognitive gesture, but the assumption of responsibility, that is, the way in which one expresses oneself and acknowledges the other person. Here, as Davide Sparti writes, the aspect blind can correctly identify the state a person is in, but fails to grasp how that state challenges as a members of a community. Aspect blindness, therefore, writes Davide Sparti, is not a cognitive incapacity, but rather an indifferent, uninvolved person who lacks imagination. But what exactly does it mean that aspect blindness involves an indifferent attitude, and how does this inexpressive attitude relate to a lack of the imagination? If one recalls that, I quote, "the concept of aspect is related to the concept of imagination," and further, that seeing an aspect and imagining are subject to the will, aspect blindness can be understood as a form of an unwillingness to acknowledge this unique human being in the situation at hand. I would argue that this unwillingness involves a double form of blindness and implies a lack of the imagination. First, the aspect blind does not want to draw a number of connections in order to read the other expression in an appropriate way, according to that particular context. In this sense, the aspect blind suffers from a block of imagination. The aspect blind does not see the other's expression against an appropriate background, but is held captive by a single aspect and is therefore stuck in a fixed and crystallized meaning, without being able to imagine different kind of connection. that is, a different interpretative context which would shed light on the other expression. Hence, the aspect blind cannot switch from one aspect to the other, cannot draw different connections in order to see the expression of another person according to a different interpretative background. Wittgenstein makes this clear with the example of the aspects of the triangle. He writes that the same triangle, I quote, can be seen as a triangular whole, as a solid, as a geometrical drawing, as standing on its base, as hanging from its apex, as a mountain, as a wedge, as an arrow or pointer, and as a various other things. By imagining a different interpretative context, that is, by drawing different connections, a new aspects emerge and the triangle is seen in a different way. Indeed, one sees an object according to an interpretation, as Wittgenstein writes, but how is possible to see an object according to an interpretation, asks Wittgenstein interlocutor. The question presents itself as a strange fact, as if something had been pressed into a mold it not really fit into, but no squeezing, no pressing took place here. From this perspective, I would portray the aspect blind as someone who's fixed on and held captive by a single aspect, because she's reluctant to imagine different interpretative contexts for that particular human expression in order to see according to a new interpretation. From this perspective, I would argue that the aspect blind embodies an inexpressive mode of response due to a block of the imagination. This block of the imagination can be further explored by looking at the case of aspect drawing in the famous unstable dark rabbit picture. The picture has not changed and yet is completely changed. Now there is a rabbit. I cry out. Wittgenstein writes, what I perceive in the lightening up of an aspect is not a property of the object, but the internal relation between it and other objects. In the case of the expression of others, what is at stake is the internal relation between this particular expression and its interpretative background, that is, the phase that this single emotion acquires as an embodied expression within a field of interpretative possibilities, within, I quote, those patterns which recur with different variations in the weave of our life. For example, I can recognize the timidity of a phase in terms of a field on interpretative possibilities, that is, in terms of a weave of expressive embodied practices. As I get to know the person better, I can make other connections. For example, I can see her face no longer as shy but as attentive. In both cases, the point is to draw a number of connections in order to see and respond to the other person in an expressive way. The point here is to develop what Wittgenstein calls menschenkenness. Since the aspect blind does not want to imagine different interpretative backgrounds, since she does not want different connection, the aspect blind performs the same inexpressive and mechanical reaction. I would like to emphasize a second intertwined aspect of this blindness. The internal relation between an emotion as an embodied expression and its context does not only point to an interpretative background. Rather, this internal relation also implies that I let the expression of another matter to me. It means that I draw a connection between the other expression and my own as a living being. Someone who is blind to others, as Cavell puts it, I quote, is missing something about himself, or rather, something about his connection with these people, his internal relation with them, so to speak. Someone who is blind to the expression of a face does not let the expression of the other matter. The aspect blind merely knows the other expression of pain, for example, but does not see the humanity of the other as a fellow human being, so as to respond to that pain in an expressive way. Here, the internal relation of my expression to yours is missing. The claim that your expression makes on me is not seen. From this perspective, the very concept of seeing the expression of others in all the fine shades implies a twofold practical responsibilities. It means expressing oneself in order to make oneself be acknowledged by others, and at the same time, it means drawing a number of connections in order to respond to the other person in an expressive way and acknowledge her. By merely knowing others and thus adopting an inexpressive attitude, the aspect blind does not accept this twofold practical responsibility, which is related to the very imponderable evidence of psychological context. Our understanding of others does not involve epistemological knowledge. Rather, it points to a practical task that can always fail. As Wittgenstein writes, I quote, not to explain, but to accept the psychological phenomenon. That is what is difficult. From this perspective, I would like to recall the main points of my argument so far. I claimed that the first form of blindness embodies an attitude, an inexpressive mode of living, in which one does not see and sense the very individual embodied character of the other person. One does not want to imagine different interpretative contexts in order to see and respond to another expression in light of them. By merely knowing another, one becomes fixed on and held captive by one single aspect, so that one responds to another in an inexpressive way. One avoids taking responsibility for expressing oneself and for acknowledging the other. I would like to analyze a second form of everyday blindness, that to meaning. I would argue that this form of aspect blindness can be understood as a way of emptying out our contribution to the expressiveness of language. As Wittgenstein writes, the importance of the concept of aspect blindness lies in the connection between the concept of seeing an aspect and experiencing the meaning of a world. There could be human beings to whom all this was alien. They could not have an attachment to their words. And how are these feelings manifested among us? By the way we choose and value words. A community of meaning-blind people would lack the attachment to their words. They could not taste, they find shades and use the words as we do. Thus, it's precisely the attachment to our words that enable us to use them in further context, to expand their meanings in an expressive way, and to express ourselves for others. Secondary meaning, for example, like tasting and saying that an A is yellow and an U is brown. Poetry, finding the right words in a difficult conversation with a friend or in a text, telling a story, all these depend on this attachment. And these are only striking examples of the constitutive expressiveness of our life in language. Hence, the attachment to our words is connected, I quote, to the ability to get an eye for their fine shades. Our attachment to our words is further related to the very blurred character of the inherited language practices by which we express ourselves, respond to others, and inhabit a shared world. Such a blurred dimension cannot be eliminated in favor of a more suitable, clearer, and sharper definition. Rather, it's precisely this blurred dimension that enables the expressiveness of language as such, that is to say, of our lives. As Wittgenstein famously writes, I quote, one can say that the concept of a game is a concept with blurred edge, but is a blurred concept a concept at all? Is a photograph that is not sharp a picture of a person at all? Is it even always an advantage to replace a picture that is not sharp by one that is? Isn't one that isn't sharp often just what we need? From this perspective, I would definitely agree with William Day when he claims, I quote, that Wittgenstein's interest in the concept of aspect blindness develops out of a preoccupation found in part 1 of the investigation with our attraction to the familiar, modern, I would add, philosophical idea of perfect mutual intelligibility, that is the prize we would gain with the solution to the problem of meaning. The image of a community of aspect blind people answers perfectly to that impulse in philosophy, which stipulates the elimination of my part in what I see and in what I mean, my responsiveness to it and my responsibility for it, an impulse that asks us finally to relinquish our will. From this perspective, the second form of aspect blindness can be understood as a way of emptying out our contribution to the expressiveness of our shared practice of language, and points to an impulse both in ordinary life and in philosophy to be blind to our own embodied conceptions and involvement in situations, so as to avoid a critical confrontation with them, and thus our responsibility to contribute to our shared practice of language. From this perspective, I would argue that Wittgenstein's exploration of a community of aspect-blind people embodies an exercise of the imagination that draws attention to our own attitude to ourselves, others, and our life in language. Imagining a community of aspect-blind people, therefore, has a therapeutic and transformative dimension. The imaginative exploration allows us to become aware from within of our own unwillingness to draw the right connection, of our own block of the imagination. This exercise of the imagination invites us to come back to ourselves in order to critically confront our own blindness. It urges us to become aware of the various ways in which we resist and avoid taking responsibility for expressing ourselves, respond to others, and contribute to the expressiveness of our shared practice of language. This also means that the unwillingness we show is not just a lack of the will, understood as a lack of strength or self-discipline, but rather a refusal to see. Here, as Cavell puts this point, I quote, "I'm not thinking of the will as a kind of strength which I may have more or less, but as a perspective which I may or may not be able to take upon myself. So one may say that the will is not a phenomenon, but an attitude toward phenomena." As Joel Beckstrom writes, I quote, "Changes are blocked not by simple misunderstanding, but by a refusal to see the character of our own involvement in situation." A refusal to see, I said, but of course it is a refusal of self-deception, and thus a refusal to see which refuses to see itself too, and is thus subjectively experienced as a real blindness. Moreover, I would argue that Wittgenstein's philosophical practice also has a more general therapeutic and transformative dimension, which aims to critically change the modern Cartesian conception that we have inherited and embodied. By inviting readers to imagine a community of aspect-blind people, Wittgenstein makes us realize where the modern metaphysical picture that make our relationship to ourselves, others, and the world a matter of mere knowledge, of mere epistemological knowledge, lead us. In doing so, he makes us and himself aware of our own Cartesian refusal to see, blindness, and aspect fixation. As Slaton puts this point, I quote, "What needs retraining or reorienting in Wittgenstein philosophical practices are some of the mental habits or picture we have collectively inherited and which guide society as we know. Among these are, for example, the idea of a unified, self-transparent, disembodied mind and certain ideas of autonomy. For the sake of brevity, we might call this idea Cartesian premises. Wittgenstein's modern spiritual exercises are made for the modern Cartesian mind. Wittgenstein's work on how one sees things revolves around the ability to see, because getting a clear vision is the best way of getting clear about oneself. We have to learn to use our eyes. These Cartesian habits of thought involve, above all, a self-understanding as a transparent, disembodied, and sovereign subject, as well as an understanding of our relation to others and the world, which is ensured, deflected, and displaced in the form of a matter of epistemological knowledge. Such Cartesian habits of thought are the forms of blindness that Wittgenstein's modern spiritual exercises therapeutically seek to transform. these forms of blindness points to collective attitudes and habits in which we avoid the difficult and painful task of relating to ourselves, others, and the world, and thus our responsibility for our shared form of life. To use Cavell's term, we deflect or displace this ethical difficulty by turning it into a less painful endeavor, namely a matter of epistemological knowledge. I would like to quote this passage from Claim of Reason. Traditional philosophy fails to take this gap, the gap between mind and world, seriously as a real, a practical problem. It has either filled it with God or bridged it with universal, which ensure the mind's collusion with the world. Or else it has denied on theoretical grounds that it could be filled or bridged at all. I think this is something Nietzsche meant when he ridiculed philosopher for regarding life as a riddle, as a problems of knowledge, implying that we question what we cannot fail to know in order not to seek what it would be painful to find out. Hence, the search for an epistemological solution to the problem of the knowledge of other minds, of ourselves and of the world, as well as the search for a solution to the problem of meanings, involves a displacement of a more deeper practical and ethical difficulties. Such epistemological riddles are therefore embodied attitudes. They point to desire to secure and control our relation to ourselves, others, and the world by making it a matter of epistemological knowledge. From this perspective, such Cartesian habits of thought are embodied desire to avoid the difficult and painful task of acknowledging others, contributing to the expressiveness of our life and language, and expressing ourselves. Practical tasks that cannot be theoretically answered, since they can always fail. So I would certainly agree with Lars Letten when he claims that such habits of thought are hard to die. I would suggest against and beyond him that such habits are hard to die, not primarily because they point to sedimented practices. Rather, such habits of thought are hard to die because they are forms of resistance of the will, as Wittgenstein puts it in the Betriebsskript. Such embodied habits of thought are hard to die because they are comfortable and reassuring. They deflect our attention away from the most painful task of accepting the contingency of our practice, our finitude, and our embodied vulnerability, that is, our relationality as embodied beings, and thus our non-sovereign responsibility for our shared form of life. Indeed, such Cartesian epistemological habits, to put it with Cavell, are ways of making of our finitude an intellectual lack. From this perspective, I would argue that such habits of thought are hard to change since they point to embodied resistance of the will, that is, defensive, answering desires. In summary, in the second part of my talk, I've argued that Wittgenstein's exploration of a community of aspect-blind people embodies an exercise of the imagination which has a twofold therapeutic and transformative purpose. On the one hand, such an exercise makes us attentive to the various ordinary ways, both biographical, personal, and social, in which we avoid taking responsibility for expressing oneself, responding to others, and contributing to the expressiveness of language. This exercise of the imagination, therefore, involves an ongoing and open-ended work on oneself, on one's own self-deception, refusal to see, resistances, and blindness. On the other hand, such an exercise of the imagination makes us aware of the risk we take when we reproduce such Cartesian habits of thought without being aware of them. Imagining a community of aspect-blind people makes us aware of our own collective Cartesian embodied blindness, as well as the resistance of the will and self-deceptions that nurture the reproduction of such habits of thought. Nevertheless, imagining a community of aspect-blind people is just one of the many exercises of the imagination that Wittgenstein investigation invite us to perform. As Hadot has stressed in relation to Hellenistic philosophy, spiritual exercises include a number of exercises of the imagination, such as the contemplation of death or the view from above, practiced by the Stoic. In the third and final part of my talk, I would like to briefly sketch out 3 more different critical transformative exercises of the imagination that are involved in the investigation. Such exercises aim to transform, as Hadot puts it, one vision of the world and thus oneself. When, for example, Marcus Aurelius admonishes himself to put human affairs into perspective by applying the famous view from above, or to seize food as that flesh in order to train his eyes for the mortal constitution of all things, these exercises are all about changing one vision. It's crucial to note, however, that Wittgenstein exercises are not intended to place philosophers in an eternal cosmic order, as it is the case with the Stoics. Rather, Wittgenstein exercises engage in a critical confrontation both with our own modern and Cartesian habits of thought and with our own embodied social practices. I would like to sketch the first kind of transformative critical exercises by inviting the reader to imagine where the metaphysical pictures that hold us captive lead us. Wittgenstein makes us and himself aware of our own blindness. In a famous example from the investigation, Wittgenstein invites us to imagine our inner lives as emotions, and emotion as beetle in a box, the contents of which are known only by the owner. In performing this exercise of the imagination, we realize that seeing emotions as private, inner objects leads us to live a life in which emotions do not mean and matter at all, a life in which we do not express ourselves at all. I quote, "For the box might even be empty." Wittgenstein makes us aware of our own unwillingness and blindness, that is, of our fixation on one captivating aspect. Through these specific exercises, we become aware of our embodied preconception and blindness to the inner when we understand it as a mental process and when we understand ourselves as isolated, disembodied subject. This embodied Cartesian preconception and blindness is seen and accepted as such. A similar exercise of the imagination which pushes us to the limits of what is unimaginable for us, thereby making us aware of the impossibility of living by reproducing such Cartesian habits of thought, is also evident in some hilarious exercises of the imagination that are part of the investigation. Take the following example. Say, yes, this pen is blunt, oh well, I do. First with thought, then without thought. Then just think the thought without the words. And further, utter a sentence and think it. Utter it with understanding, and now don't utter it, and just do what you accompanied it with when you utter it with understanding. Sing this song with expression, and now don't sing it, but repeat its expression. Hence, this first kind of exercise of imagination, as Lars Leden writes, I quote, has a critical function. They push us to the limits of what is imaginable for us, thereby making us aware of where certain pictures and lines of thought lead us. I would argue beyond Leden's reading of the investigation that this is not the only kind of exercise of the imagination involved. A second type of exercise pervades Wittgenstein texts. It consists in imagining different interpretative contexts of our language uses and practices in order to reveal different aspects of phenomena and thus learn to see them anew. Indeed, such a practice of the imagination pervades the investigation. The reader is repeatedly involved and invited to follow the author in this practice. Formulas like think of, imagine, suppose, compare are ubiquitous. I quote, I should like you to say, yes, it's true, that can be imagined, that may even be happened, but was I trying to draw your attention to the fact that you are able to imagine this? I wanted to put this picture before your eyes, and your acceptance of these pictures consists in your being inclined to regard a given case differently, that is, to compare it with this series of pictures. I've changed your way of seeing. I quote again, the concept we have show what selection of phenomena we make, what interests us. Aspect may change automatically, but one always can change an aspect voluntarily. This distinguishes seeing as from seeing red, say. I would argue, therefore, that Wittgenstein language games embodies way of practicing imagination in order to change our way of things by reordering the selection of the phenomena we make, that is, by shifting what interests us. The method of übersichtliche Darstellung, I quote, produced precisely that kind of understanding which consists in seeing connections, hence the importance of finding and inventing intermediate links. By inventing intermediate links, that is, by imagining new interpretative contexts or backgrounds, by seeing different connections, we see things anew. This practice of the imagination, which works through similes, comparison, pictures, and example, transform our attitude towards self, others, and the world. It changes, I quote, how we look at others. In other words, it changes what aspects of ourself, others, and the world interest us. As Oscar Ricosella put this point, perspicuous presentation involves, among other things, as Wittgenstein says, the introduction of novel expression with the purpose of making it easier to achieve a clear comprehension of conceptual relations. An example of such a novel expression would be a concept redefined in a simplifying way in order to highlight a certain aspect or aspects of the actual context. Wittgenstein writes, the aspect of things that are most important for us are hidden because of their simplicity and familiarity. One is unable to notice something because it's always before our own eyes. The real foundation of the inquiry do not strike people at all, unless the fact has at some time struck them, and this means we fail to be struck by what once seen is most striking and most powerful. The very pervasive method of the investigation, therefore, points to an exercise of the imagination that by drawing new connection and shifting the interpretative background of phenomena, make us to see them anew. Such exercises sharpen our sensitivity. I would like to make an example. The very use of the simile language game is an example of these exercises of the imagination that shifts what aspects of language interest us. The simile shifts the interpretative background against which we see and relate to our life in language. Instead of seeing and relating to our language as a medium at our disposal through which we represent an already given reality and express an hidden mental life, thanks to the simile, we look at our language from the background of the practice playing. In this way, we develop a sensitivity to different aspects of our shared life in language. We see, for example, that speaking a language like playing a game is part of a shared activity. Moreover, we become attentive to our own contribution to our shared practice of language, as well as to the way in which we respond to others in our daily life. Indeed, the very use of similes and analogies embodies exercise of the imagination, aimed at transforming our way of seeing and thus our attitude. As Wittgenstein writes, I quote, someone who teaches philosophy nowadays gives his pupil food not because they are to his taste, but in order to change his taste. A good simile refreshes the intellect. I would like to sketch out a third and final kind of exercises of the imagination. Wittgenstein repeatedly asks us to imagine fictional or altered form of life. He invites us, for example, to imagine tribes that use money for their trade in arbitrary way, or that play a chess-like game by yelling and stamping their feet. By imagining altered or fictional form of life, as David Asparti writes, I quote, Wittgenstein seeks to remove the dogmatic inclination to believe that our language and our form of life must be as it is. Such exercises, as Anna Boncompagni suggests, make us aware, I quote, of the normativity and contingency of our social practices, their constraining power and their plasticity. These exercises, therefore, involve an open-ended critical self-confrontation with both the normativity and contingency of our embodied social practices, that is, an awareness of our blindness to them, and the development of a sensitivity to different possibilities. I would claim, therefore, that such third kind of exercise of imagination sharpen our sensitivity and sense of possibility. In conclusion, I've argued that the investigations embody ongoing open-ended exercise of the imagination. Such exercises call our attention in many ways to our own various forms of blindness and self-deceptions. Furthermore, through this exercise, we cultivate a sensitivity to the fine shades of behavior in ourselves and in others, as well as to the plurality of aspects of our shared world. I will conclude by recalling Wittgenstein's words. Fine shades of behavior and meaning. Why are they important? They have important consequences. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Lucilla. It was really fascinating, and it certainly added a new and important perspective to our ongoing discussions on the notion of philosophy as a way of life and spiritual exercises. It was great to listen to your talk, and I'm sure there will be questions now. Elder has already raised his hand. Elder, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Lucilla, for this wonderful presentation. It was very stimulating. I found the parallels in this dialogue with Pierre Hadot very illuminating, and it was fascinating to see how these similar thought patterns are developed by Wittgenstein in his text and similar practices. One of the things I thought the most while you were talking concerned the references you made to the will and to the idea, for instance, of refusing to see. And I was thinking this in contrast with ancient philosophy. This is actually a point where Marta and I have strong disagreements, but I have a very intellectualistic understanding of ancient philosophy, where if you all the exercises aim at changing our way of seeing things, and if our way of seeing things changes, our life automatically changes. So it's never about practicing, exercising the will or transforming the will in any way or only indirectly. So it is basically about transforming knowledge, the way of understanding, transforming the meaning of things. And coming from this perspective, if we look at what you presented in Wittgenstein, it seems it is for me problematic to see how doing these exercises, and as you said, many of them bring to consciousness our aspect blindness. Why would that change us if there's at the bottom of this lies a refusal to see? So why should I care if I have aspect blindness? That doesn't change me in any way. I still refuse to see. So how does that act over the will? How can that transform the will? Because one could argue that if it is a matter of the will, all these exercises and making us aware of something, having conscientia, having this knowledge of what is happening, wouldn't produce any effect. So it would be meaningless to do these exercises. And I have two other questions that are, I think, quicker. One of them is, and I'm not a Wittgenstein specialist, so perhaps there's a strong consensus about this that not informed of, but are these exercises that you were presenting meant as monologues, as dialogues, as individual exercises, as shared exercises? Does it change according to the passage or the text? How are these being understood? And this is connected with the third question, if these exercises are meant to or can work at an individual level, regardless of Wittgenstein's intention while writing it. Can they work at an individual level, or since this shared experience of language is fundamental here, they can also work only as shared exercises?
Thank you very much for your very important question. I'm struggling with this refusal to see and the will. I have a tentative answer. Actually, the first exercise that I found in the investigation was not concerned with this kind of blindness and awareness of blindness, but it was more concerned with this idea of seeing something from a different perspective. The second kind of exercises. For sure, my tentative answer is, in order to change the way you see things, you have to become aware from the block of the imagination of the own blindness that you have. That's why I would say that the first task is this becoming aware of blindness, because without this work on the will, and I think that it's important to see that the will is not like a self-discipline or strength. It's not an hidden mental phenomenon, but is an attitude toward phenomenon. And if we take seriously the idea of Wittgenstein that seeing is an attitude towards something, then not seeing, refusing to see, is also an attitude. And the idea is, if I become aware of my blindness, I become aware of an attitude of myself. In this way, I can work in somehow to change the perspective. But without this awareness, I will not start to wanting to change myself. I mean,
but why would I want to work on it? That's what's puzzling for me in this context. Why would I want to work on it?
Yeah, I think that's a very important question. I did not mention it in this talk. You're right, because this kind of blindness produce a kind of absence of peace. That's the idea of Wittgenstein. The idea that the metaphysical pictures are not only, I mean, are resistance of the will, but with this kind of resistance of the will, we cannot live in peace. And the idea of Wittgenstein is, I would like to stop doing philosophy when I want. And the idea is sozusagen, the idea is to find a peace which cannot be found, because I mean, this kind of Cartesian or blindness, everyday and philosophical blindness will never disappear once and for all. And maybe the idea is also to free ourselves to the idea that we could reach a definite liberation. That's the first, the first answer. The second answer, individual shared exercises. I would say that both. That there are, for example, the more traditional reading in Wittgenstein reads much more this idea of in dialogue with ourselves. But there is a very beautiful work by Beth Savicki, which practices, for example, this kind of exercises also in prisons. So, for example, in a pub with a completely different context, in which, for example, this kind of investigation turned to be collective exercises in which we do something together. I would not say that the two are opposite versions of this kind of exercises. And I also think that it's important to remind us that that Wittgenstein in the foreword of the investigation tell us that the way in which this book will be used is somehow open. I mean, it's our it's our somehow task to further develop this kind of philosophical methods It's not like, I would say, it's constitutively open. And it's also, I mean, the idea of this kind of exercise is that we continue them in such a way. And the last question, can you repeat the last?
Yeah, so it concerned this aspect that you emphasize a lot, and that Wittgenstein emphasizes a lot, of language, or the shared experience of language, or language as a shared world. And if this implies that I can only truly transform myself if in a certain way I transform the others around me, so the ones I share the world or the language with.
I would say that there is no dimension in life which for Wittgenstein completely only yours is. And if I change the relation to myself, I change at the same time the relation to the world and to the others. That's why I would say that there is no a dimension in which, I mean, a private dimension, never, even though you are by yourself, like reading the investigations.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's very illuminating.
Thanks.
Thank you, Pedro Dotto.
Thank you very much for the talk, Lucilla. It was brilliant and fantastic. I really enjoyed your connection between Wittgenstein, your Cavelian Wittgenstein, and how it relates to Pierre Hadot's approach to spiritual exercises. So thank you very much for sharing this. I have two comments. One, the first is a comment, the second is a question. In the remarks on Fraser's Golden Bowl, Wittgenstein states that to convince someone of the truth, it's not enough to state the truth, but rather we must find the path from error to the truth. And in your reconstruction of how the investigation works with the polyphony and the voice of temptation and the this dialogue between voices, leading to dead alleys because of our entrenched Cartesian habits of thoughts and our modern intellectual inheritance, seem to embody just this kind of approach, not simply to state what would be the correct way of thinking about ourselves and our relation to others and to the world, but to lead gently, carefully the reader to some into some directions, and then to show that this direction leads to a dead alley. So it's better to take another route. And so this is the first comment, if you could. This remark from Wittgenstein's remark on Fraser's Golden Ball and your reconstruction and rereading of the investigation. And the second point is the following. I don't know if you've thought about relating your reading of Wittgenstein with Cavell's concept of moral perfectionism or Emersonian perfectionism, which is not a theory or a doctrine, but it's a register of our moral life, which there is a disconnection between ourselves and what we aspire to be, this higher and achievable self. So I'd like to hear your thoughts if you consider about using this concept from Cavell in your understanding of Wittgenstein. Thank you very much, Lucilla.
Thank you very much for your very important question. The first one, yeah, it's pivotal to understand the idea of Wittgenstein of doing philosophy is not about stating theories, but in convincing. And for convincing, and in order to let you realize that a path somehow will lead you in a dead alley, it's not enough that I show you an argument, that I tell you something, but the idea is to substitute some captivating pictures with other liberating pictures. And that's why it's so important, this idea of analogies, similes, and pictures, because in this way you can really be convinced that it's much more worth to consider, to see a situation, a phenomena from a different perspective. And I would say that also the remarks in über Gewissheit, this idea that at the end there is the conviction, also between, for example, a conflict between different word pictures. The idea is sozusagen this kind of conflicts cannot be theoretically solved, but it can also just be, I mean, I can only convince you of the of my own word picture through simile and rhetoric method, which bring you to believe it. That's the point. And I would say that it is also why Wittgenstein writes in this way, and why the text is like ubiquitous with a lot of analogies, similes, like also pictures and this kind of use of language. The second, moral perfectionism and Cavell. Yeah, for sure, I would say that another version of a modern spiritual exercise is indeed Cavell moral perfectionism. I would say that here you have more explicit a dimension of Wittgenstein philosophy which remains implicit. And I would say that the point which in Wittgenstein it's not so much underlined, which in Cavell it's very clear, it's this idea that the work on yourself is at the same time a work of a critical role of your culture. That's why, and of the possibility of your culture. And in this sense, moral perfectionism in Cavellian terms is always a comparison between what you are and what you could be, this attainable, not attained, but attainable self. This idea of a potential self, which is at the same time a potential society, a potential culture. But I would say that this move is also implicit in Wittgenstein, but he would not prescribe how to do it, and he would not describe how to do it. He does and did it. And this is different from a Cavellian style, for example.
Thank you. David, Deval?
Is my voice okay?
Yes.
Okay. Last time I sounded like Mickey Mouse on it. I'm with the spirit of everything you've done, and it's not unfair, but I'm inside a different Wittgensteinian journey, let's say. And so there's something that I want to get to, but first, some say Haddo misreads Wittgenstein. So there's that position, but I don't think you have done that in your presentation. So that to me is quite important. Where I'm coming from is the Rush Rees, because that's what I was taught in Swansea and all this. So you probably know that there's a different view than the Cora Diamond. So I want to ask you, what do you understand by the therapeutic and the consequences of that? And then a more difficult one, which is in the big typescript, what do you think he means by imaginability? Because I see that within a logical criterion, whereas they're potentially, I just want you to say, what do you think? Sorry, my phone just went. So to use the net sense of imagination and to, as it were, not attack you, but invite you, there is this smattering of terms always inside Wittgenstein, attitude, will, and you can, before you know it, you've settled in a different bedrock as if these are sensible. So I'm coming from a genuine, when you're using them, could you clarify? Because I do agree there is an excess, sorry. Turn that off earlier. Dear me. Is that gone? Yeah, sorry about that. Get my train of thought back. So I agree as an exercise, but I'd be leaning towards a more kenotic approach, the idea of the negative knowledge, whereas you seem to be definitely emphasizing a self, not like Cavell, perfectionism, but well, for want of a better word, you're transformed into something better. And I'm not sure if that's what you intend. And you didn't use belief very much, whereas some see aspect blindness and expressions of belief as more about, Peter Winch does that kind of thing. So it's a genuine, if we are taking on the idea of exercises of transformation, these are the puzzles that I still feel leave us in the Wittgenstein's terms, if you like: will, attitude, imagination, and therapeutic. So just further comments really on bringing Wittgenstein into the way of life, but not necessarily, I would say, the legacy of Hadot.
Yeah, it's a difficult question. I'm not sure if it's a better self. I mean, what does it mean that it's better? That's a huge question. I would say that it's not better in the sense that, in which sense it's better?
That's fine.
Yeah. I would say that in Wittgenstein, I think this idea of a perspective which this idea of picture which holds us captive, and picture which free us. It's not like a dichotomic idea. That's why we have only, captivating pictures, and then we can substitute it with freeing picture and we are somehow better person. I would say that the point, it's much more an idea of a critical work on oneself, of like a way of seeing from this different perspective, like a pluralization of perspective on oneself, on the other of the words. And that's why also like a therapeutic work on the picture which holds us captive. I'm not sure, and I do not agree completely with Cora Diamond. And on the one hand, I think that it's pretty important, this idea to realize what I would like to say and that I'm speaking no sense. But I would say that also in the spirit of Cora Diamond, these exercises of imagination are, for example, the exercises which are present in literature for her, are ways of cultivating a sensitivity for different aspects. And I would say that this dimension which Cora Diamond develops according to the work of literature, for example, is also present in the style and aesthetic form of Wittgenstein's investigation. And what Wittgenstein means with imagination, for sure, I think I would go with the concept of imagination, not as logical space. For sure, because I'm reading the second part of of the investigations, and I think that there you can find an idea of imagination, which is a field of interpretative possibility, which cannot be separated from the visual fields. And I would say that he rethinks this idea of logical space according to this idea of gestalt. This idea of background and figure. But this is a huge, that would, pertains the entire philosophy of Wittgenstein and the relation between the early and the later and so on. But but about the better self, that's, I would say it's not maybe better, it's more critical, more aware of herself.
Great answers. I really, you hit the direction I believe we should go in. So that's great. I like that. And it's really good to hear, because imagination can appear to be some form of self or, mental activity. So I think that's what I wanted to draw out. So that's excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are there further questions? If not, since we still have some minutes, maybe I will take the floor. I did have some actually very general questions, but which relate with the discussion we've been having. The first one relates to Elder's question and our eternal disagreement on what it takes to change one's life, so to say. And I think you added this interesting perspective, and maybe, I don't know, considering Wittgenstein might help us to understand what is needed to actually change a behavior. In the specific case of spiritual exercises, or more concretely, in the exercises of imagination, what would you say they add to a certain set of theories about the world you already hold as true, so to say? This is Elder's intellectualism. In principle, if you are already convinced that something is true, or that a certain behavior is correct, you necessarily will act that way. Hadot evidently disagrees also in his interpretation of ancient philosophy, and Wittgenstein seems to disagree as well, or I don't know what you think about that. So what the specific question is, in Wittgenstein, as for ancient philosophy it applies as well, what does a specific spiritual exercise, and specifically an exercise of imagination, add to a certain proposition you already hold true? Like, for example, you are convinced, you know that you are mortal. That's not, I mean, it's not something you will contest. You absolutely know you are mortal. So why should you need to meditate on death, for example? What does this exercise of imagination adds to your conviction that you will die? I tend to think it like as a giving force. It is even an expression I think that Foucault uses, giving force to a certain already acquired truth, so that it really has a etopoietic force on your character, or etopoietic action, that it really transforms you. Okay, this would be the first question. Then the second would be a metaphilosophical one. Philosophy as a way of life is generally described as having self-transformation as an end. So in a way, theories, doctrines are placed in a secondary or subordinate place or role regarding that final end goal, which is self-transformation. In your answer to Pedro, you said that philosophy for Wittgenstein was not about stating theories, but about convincing. Is this aim of convincing people or persuading them directly connected to an aim of transforming them? Would you say that for Wittgenstein, transformation is also the end goal, or would that be too reductive when it comes to Wittgenstein? I was thinking of the ladder, the famous metaphor of the ladder. When we have achieved a certain self-transformation, can we get rid of philosophy? And and finally, a very quick and general question. When we speak about therapeutic philosophy, or the conception of philosophy as therapy, the first names that come to our minds are, of course, the Hellenistic philosophers and then Wittgenstein. But generally, scholars make a distinction. It's not the same kind of therapy that is at stake in the Hellenistic philosophers and in Wittgenstein. In principle, Wittgenstein's therapy is directed only at philosophers. It's a therapy of language, and it has no use for common people, so to say. While listening to your talk, I had the impression that you had a different reading, and I wanted to confirm if that is so. Do you think Wittgenstein can be therapeutic also for common people, non-academics, non-philosophers? Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Marta, for these very important and difficult questions about the truth. I think from a Wittgensteinian perspective, I could not say that I know a truth and then I have to somehow enforce my behavior through this kind of knowledge. Because I would say that the way in which you know something, it's also at the same time a way in which you relate to yourself and to the world and the other. So the point is not so much to know something and then to enforce your behavior according to it. And I would say that it's also a huge somehow difference between also a Hadot approach. When we say, for example, that there is a doctrine, a true doctrine, and then I have to live according to the doctrine somehow. I would say that in Wittgenstein, if you have a perspective about a truth or a knowledge, you have a kind of way of relating already to ourselves and to the others. And the point is to question which kind of relation to yourself and to the other this kind of truth involve. That's why it's very ambiguous also, the relation between knowledge of the others and acknowledging the others. Because I mean, the point is exactly a difference in a very, very tiny difference of attitude. I don't know if I answered your question, but I would say that knowing something is already a way of behaving for Wittgenstein. And the point is in which way you know something. I mean, which kind of knowledge is at stake? So I would answer the question. The second question about giving up or getting rid of philosophy, I would say, I mean, if we figure out that Wittgenstein wrote on certainty, almost dying with this kind of notes, I would say that he tried, and he also did get rid of philosophy by, for example, building the sister house on the one hand. It's very famous, the idea, the gardener, and so on. I would say that Wittgenstein is not, it's very open, the idea of doing philosophy in Wittgenstein. And it can be practiced in different ways. And I would not exclude, for example, that some ecstatic practices and also some way of living in an ordinary way could be thought as living in a Wittgensteinian spirit. In the sense that if we take I mean, seriously, the idea that this kind of philosophy makes us confront with our own blindness, I would not say that it's just a matter for philosophers, for example, but it's a much more general aim, both for a critique of society on the one hand, and also the possibility of imagining different interpretative context for our practices. I would say that the methodological tools which Wittgenstein give us let us expand this idea of therapy. It's not like a therapy of language, that there is the ordinary language philosopher who somehow corrects the metaphysician because he or she is not speaking in the proper ordinary way. This is a reading of Wittgenstein. It can be true, I don't know, but it's not, I mean, I would say it's not interesting to read Wittgenstein in this way, because there are also very interesting works that try to connect. I have to think an Alice Crary. I have to think, and for example, the Wittgenstein conferences will take place this August, and the topic is feminism and Wittgenstein. And I mean, the idea is that there are a lot of tools that you can use also to make somehow a critique of culture with this kind of methodological tools. That's why I would say that, yeah, I do not agree with the reading of therapeutic in the sense of correcting through an ordinary language perspective, the metaphysical uses of language. I would use Wittgenstein for this kind of self-transformative on the one hand, and also, I mean, the idea that we can use this kind of exercises also as an awareness of our social blindness. I did not find a very good example, but I will work on it. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. And I hope we can see your paper published soon. We are already over our time, and I will now close the session. Thank you once again, all of you, for being there, and especially Lucilla for the brilliant talk and discussion. We'll come back in January. In the meantime, I wish you all a happy Christmas season and all the best for the new year. So see you next year.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Thank you very much, Marta, and all of you for.
Thank you.
Ciao.
Ciao.